Trip the Beltway Fantastic. We are just days away from the presidential election. In fact, we're entering the final weekend. Interestingly, Donald Trump appears to have seized on all of Kamala Harris's weaknesses on foreign policy, particularly the hell she has been taking from her left flank over Gaza to try and peel off voters in key states, including Michigan and Wisconsin, which we know have big Muslim American populations. So while Kamala Harris has been campaigning with neoconservative Liz Cheney, blowing the minds of her progressive base, many of whom no doubt see the looming face of Dick Cheney and both father and daughter support for the global war on terror in every step they make on the campaign trail, Trump has been talking about peace in the Middle East, ending the war in Ukraine, and reanimating his attacks on the George W. Bush administration. His running mate, J.D. Vance, meanwhile, actually posted on X late last week that, quote, Israel has the right to defend itself, but America's interest is sometimes going to be distinct. Sometimes we're going to have overlapping interests, and sometimes we're going to have distinct interests. And our interest, I think very much, is not going to war with Iran. He also criticized the Harris team squarely on Gaza. Even though they say, and I'm quoting now, even though they say they want to minimize Palestinian civilian casualties, they pursue the pathway that maximizes those casualties, Vance said. They say they are pro-Israel. They pursue that pathway that has prolonged the war as long as possible, which is bad for Israel. So while Harris has been talking tough on foreign policy, indicating that she would not change Biden's policies a bit, multiple polling has found that Americans are more confident in Trump's ability to steer foreign policy in 2025. So why is this? My guest this week has written a great article all about it and is in his own right a U.S. foreign policy expert. Peter Van Buren spent over 2 decades in the Foreign Service, including a stint in Iraq during the war before retiring from the State Department in 2012. Today, he is a regular columnist for the American Conservative and the author of 3 books: We Meant Well, How I Helped Lose the Battle for the Hearts and Minds of the Iraqi People, Hooper's War, a novel of World War II, Japan, and Ghosts of Tom Joad, a story of the 99%. Welcome, Peter. I'm so glad to have you on Trip the Beltway. Fantastic.
Kelly, it's a pleasure to be here. That was quite an introduction. Thank you.
And I have read all your books and I can recommend them, and I will
you.
put them in the show notes. I'm so excited. You are a fantastic writer and thinker, and most of all, you're an emotional thinking person in terms of your writing. Reflects all of the experiences that you have incurred over the course of your diplomatic career, but also the historical view that you have taken. And I have found myself just being penetrated by your writing, particularly the novels that you wrote on World War II, but also on the 99% and the Rust Belt. And I bet that a lot of times when you're talking and thinking and watching politics, particularly when everybody's talking about the Rust Belt and the Blue Wall and all of that, a lot of the writing and the world that people like Trump and Harris are talking about when they talk about Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Illinois and different places that had been impacted by the downturn of the economy in the 1980s and the left behind of so many people and Americans there, that I guess that probably, I don't know, I would imagine that hits you a certain way because you've written so passionately about it.
It resonates very, very deeply, and I hope offers some insight into the way that Vance in particular is approaching the Midwest and trying to be persuasive there. I think Donald Trump has been making good arguments that resonate very well in the Midwest. I think people there are tired of hearing about wars overseas that don't matter to them. I think people there are much more interested in the economy and see things through an economic lens. The Harris campaign has kind of missed the boat on that. Someone who's working on how to deal with a 25% increase in grocery prices, J6 was just another day.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, more recently, or, I think it was during the town hall that she conducted with CNN and Anderson Cooper, he tried to talk a little bit about the fact that she has been alienating this very important constituency
Hmm.
in Michigan and Wisconsin over the Gaza war. And she says, yes, people are very upset about the images they see in that war, but let me tell you, they're all also very upset about the price of groceries. And it's like, well,
Yeah.
first, as far as I'm concerned, one has a lot to do with the other.
Yeah,
And what she was trying to do is sort of like change the subject, tap dance furiously away from it. But I think she was probably, in my mind, reminding people that, yeah, we're sending a lot of money over to Israel. We're sending billions of dollars of money, weapons to both Israel and Ukraine.
that's right.
Well, I'm worried about the price of groceries. My tax dollars are paying for that. And those tax rates aren't going to change anytime soon if the American government needs that money to spend on wars overseas.
And it's tremendous amounts. I mean, the last tranche that went over to the Ukraine was $60 billion. Spend it however you want. Spend it on schools, spend it on hospitals, add it to the general welfare funds. Do whatever you want with that money, but it's going to go someplace pretty significant when you spread it around the United States. When you send it overseas to Ukraine, it simply disappears. That's bad enough, but then when you take the other side of it, the thing that you just mentioned there, it comes from somewhere.
Yep.
And it either comes from printing more money, which drives inflation and hurts the regular Americans, or it comes from taxes, where it hurts the regular Americans. And I think that Harris has been really blind, Biden as well, blind to the fact that this money does come from somewhere. And where it comes from hurts the majority of American citizens, including an awful lot of people who are going to be voting on Tuesday. I'd be very surprised if we don't see that reflected in the outcomes from a lot of the swing states, the Midwest swing states.
Yeah. Well, you wrote a piece for the American Conservative this week called "What Will Trump to," meaning to, do
Mhm.
for foreign policy. And I'm just going to quote from you here. You talk about the Biden foreign policy until the present moment. And then you say Trump's foreign policy, on the other hand, saw a broader sharing of costs within NATO, albeit at the price of being falsely criticized to this day for threatening to abandon the alliance. The United States pulled most of its troops out of Iraq and Afghanistan as Trump took steps to make good on his campaign promise to wrap up the neocons' endless wars. More importantly, Trump did not initiate any new conflicts in the region, as had Clinton in Somalia, Obama and Bush everywhere else. And then you talk about the agreement with the Taliban for an
Mhm.
exit strategy for the U.S. from Afghanistan, which was culminated or finished during the Biden administration. And you point out, however, poorly executed by the
Yes.
Biden administration. And you talked about the Abraham Accords, the normalization deals, the possibility of détente with North Korea. I'm just going to, just to play the devil's advocate here. I
Sure.
mean, there was an ongoing war in Yemen, which
Hmm.
devastated the civilian population there. We fueled that literally with jet fuel and weapons to Saudi Arabia. We continued the overseas engagements in Somalia. We took out, assassinated Iran's top IRGC commander, Qasem
Yes.
Soleimani. So there was a lot of tension there. Some, we ratcheted up and mostly in rhetoric and trade, a tariff war with China, but there was always sort of that precipice that we were looking over in terms of when it might become more of a hot war. Um, some might say that things were tense and that Trump maybe wasn't as peaceful
Yeah,
as,
I think it's a matter really of scale. When you talk about
yeah.
Somalia, it doesn't scale against what's happened in the Ukraine. When you talk about Yemen, however horrible that piece of
Mhm.
war is, it doesn't scale at all compared to what you've got going on right now in Israel at war in Gaza and
Yeah.
Lebanon, and American troops on the ground now for the very first uh, overt time in Israel. So while Trump certainly, his foreign policy was certainly not perfect, and the world does what it wants to do, no matter what the United States intends, things happen, as they say. But I think it scales very, very differently. And I think also the fights that the Trump people were still involved with, many of which were leftovers from the neocon era, one way or the other, were really not with the potential to explode the way the conflicts are right now. The Ukrainian war can go in any number of different directions. You could see NATO involved. You could see nuclear weapons being used. You could see Russia taking over the large swaths of Ukraine. You could see anything going on. The North Koreans have sent 10,000 soldiers there, and we don't know how that's going to play out when the first of them start going home in body bags and the North Koreans start to get a little grumpy about all that.
Yeah.
The scale of the war in the Middle East, the scale of the war in Ukraine just dwarfed whatever the things that are hung over from the Trump administration. And I think the intent is basically very, very different. The Trump people started out with the intent of trying to make peace and trying to contain these wars. They were mostly successful. To criticize them for not being 100% successful, I think misses the point. Biden comes into office and he seems to be right back in the cowboy saddle here, ready to go take on all the ills of the world and make them. I just have to say as an aside, I can't possibly for the life of me figure out what is going on with Liz Cheney and why Kamala Harris has adopted her as her evil twin. It's simply beyond my understanding that a woman who depends so much on progressive voters and so much on Muslim voters and so much on women voters would want to ally herself with someone like Liz Cheney. I get it. Liz Cheney is a Republican who doesn't like Trump. It's not hard to pick those people out of the crowd. But my goodness, that neocon steaming pile of neocon conservative goo, I can't possibly understand the thinking behind Kamala Harris thing. And it leads me again to why I don't support her, is that this lack of judgment on these types of issues. She picks this rodeo clown, Tim Walz, as her running mate, and then she seems to have clung to Liz Cheney as if the Cheneys had some kind of knowledge that we had missed.
Like some sort of juju.
Some sort of powerful juju that we had missed here. I just have to put that in as an aside because it does factor into what we're talking about, but it's also one of those bizarro, trip the Beltway fantastic surprise endings.
Well, I mean, as you know, you've been watching these politics for decades. You know, the Democrats always seem to feel the need that they have to look tough, they have to sound tough, because God forbid they might be accused of being anti-war or soft on terrorism. And so I think about, when I talk like this, I think immediately of Senator Kerry, when he was running for president in 2004, was it, where he stood up and he said, John Kerry reporting for duty at the National Convention, so as to proclaim that the Democrats were just as tough on terrorism, which obviously it was 2004, but maybe, in a better, more human way than the Republicans had been up until that time. And it was a big turnoff. But I haven't seen, aside from Obama showing a little, or more than a little, criticism for the war in Iraq when he won. But I mean, come on. I mean, that was a focus group. I mean, people were ready to get out of that war. And so he felt comfortable criticizing the handling of that. But as you know, he turned immediately after he won to Afghanistan and basically proclaimed that as the good war, and then ended up pouring all sorts of troops and resources into the surge and reconstruction in Afghanistan. It just seems to me that Democrats are so fearful of being called out as soft on the military and on war that they end up overcorrecting. And I see this Liz Cheney romance, or whatever you want to call it, girl boss romance is an overcorrection of sorts. And I just don't know why she just didn't try to get like Nikki Haley on her side.
There you go.
Nikki Haley, I think, has decided to I don't know if she fully endorsed Trump, but You know,
It's pretty
I
lukewarm.
campaigning for
Yeah,
Republicans.
there we go. She's kind of sitting this one out, and
Yeah,
that
but
pleases them.
yeah, it's a and the sad thing is, while she's trying to walk that tightrope and endear herself to, I guess, center right anti-Trump voters, Trump is going in and trying to steal voters from her left flank by
Hmm.
appealing to Arab American constituencies. And it's happening in real time. This is Thursday, Halloween. I've seen at least a half a dozen quotes, X posts, stories about Trump talking about wanting peace in the Middle East and appealing directly to Lebanese American voters,
Hmm.
saying, I'm going to end this war in your country. I'm going to respect all parties. I mean, he's talking in language that seems to me uh, that he has somebody on his team who has the finger of the pulse on that particular voting community here in the United States. And I'm thinking, wow, I mean, well, she's over there floundering around with neocons. He's actually reading the room.
And it's the thing about it is it's not hard. I agree with everything you said there, and the thing is, it's not difficult to figure out where, for particularly Lebanese Americans or Muslim Americans, would be on these issues. When Israel invaded Lebanon in 2006, I was one of the people who was working on domestic side of that. And almost all of the domestic phone calls that we were getting and all of the congressional interest that we were getting was pouring in from Michigan. And given that it's a swing state, given that the other elements in Michigan, the blue collar elements, are probably leaning Trump to begin with, for Kamala to sacrifice that much is just, again, something that I shake my head over and just wonder who's giving her
Yeah.
advice at this point. I think one of the things that is missing from her understanding and Biden's understanding of all this, and I may be quoting J.D. Vance here, I'm not sure if he said it in so many words, but he said you can support Israel without having to support Netanyahu. And that the United States, when it has interests in the Middle East that coincide with Israel, that doesn't necessarily coincide with the interests of Netanyahu. And I think that's going to be something you'll see, is a separation between American interests in general in the Middle East and with Israel, because they are there, of course. It's our strongest ally in the arena. But they don't necessarily coincide with Netanyahu's politics, where he's trying to sustain himself in office through things. He's almost
Right.
like Kamala in that he's not reading the room. He's not seeing what's going on. Trump has basically issued him an ultimatum. Trump said to him, go in there, do what you need to do, declare your victory, and get out. And I think that's going to be what Netanyahu is hearing in private as well as in public, should Trump win next week. Hopefully
Yeah.
next week we'll know who won. But
Yeah, hopefully we'll know who won. But the devil's in the details. You
yeah,
know, what does he mean by finish it? Does he mean to just like carpet bomb the rest of Gaza? Does he mean like it, just a return to the status quo, finish the military operation, but continue the occupation, the settlements in West Bank? All of the dynamics that basically have led to today. I don't
yes,
see it, it's hard to tell. He hasn't been detailed and what he would like to see happen. And all we have is his first term, in which he was the best friend that Netanyahu had. But I know that they had somewhat of a falling out. And I think when it comes down to it, as you know, Donald Trump is very transactional and he looks out for himself. And maybe if he sees that Israel is dragging the United States down with it, that ultimatum might be pretty harsh. I'm hoping. I mean, I'll just tell you where I stand.
sure.
I would hope that the next president just tries to use the leverage that we have as a patron of Israel at the tune of $3.8 billion a year, to stop, killing and slaughtering civilians in Gaza but also Lebanon. I mean, my sense is that Israel is not going to stop. until somebody makes them stop.
Yes,
And that should be the United States saying that we're the reason why they can keep carrying out these airstrikes at the level
absolutely.
they have since October.
Absolutely. And you're going to see not only Trump, but you're going to see a whole new foreign policy team in there. Now, don't make me predict who's going to be Secretary of State, because I don't have a clue right now. Trump has played this all very close to the vest. Um, but you're going to have a lot of, I think one of the things that's going to stand out for the second Trump administration over the first one is going to be the professionalization of the people that he chooses. I think he got bitten hard last time by choosing people who were not on the team with him. I mean, the Democrats and the crazy people in the mainstream media like to use the term loyalty and fealty, and they like to imagine them clicking their heels in front of, dictator Trump and all these kind of silly things. That's not what we're talking about. Any president needs to install people in all of these political appointee jobs that support his agenda.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work when you're fighting internally against your own people and trying to get foreign policy or domestic policy for that matter, but getting any policy done when you're fighting two wars at the same time. And so when he talks about the enemy within, it may not be the most judicious of phrases to have chosen, but it sets the idea up that I think he's smarter this time around. In addition, I think the think tanks have risen up, stepped up to the challenge, and they're pouring resumes into the Trump headquarters. I know that there's not an official tie between Project 2025 and the Trump administration, but 2025 and others are gathering resumes, starting the vetting process, and hopefully we'll be able to present to Trump a fair amount of names ready to go pretty quickly. One of the things that was a problem in Trump administration one was it just took so darn long to fill key positions.
Yeah.
And the world doesn't stop and wait. Parenthetically, I just want to mention this. It's an article I'm working on right now. It's a great fear of mine, the time between the election and January inauguration, whoever wins. Because basically nobody is in charge of the United States right now. Joe Biden has checked out. He's obviously up in Looney Tunes land, the statements he's making and everything else like that. He's obviously not connected. He obviously got bought off on the deal by saying they're not going to vote the 25th Amendment on him if he agreed to the deal with Kamala as the nominee, or the appointee, I should say, to the presidency. But the idea here is that there's not going to be anybody in charge, and that's an incredible vulnerability for the United States. You're going to hope that people like Lloyd Austin step up a little bit, and I see some signs that he's doing that. He warned the North Koreans off today. Not that I think North Korea is ready to start a nuclear war, but he just kind of, give them a little brush back and remind them to step back a little bit. The whole government hasn't shut down just because Joe Biden has.
Yeah.
Hopefully that'll carry through. But it's a very vulnerable period, I think, after this election is over, particularly if Kamala, who's definitely the weaker of the candidates on foreign policy, particularly if she wins, and there's not an expectation that there's a lot of things coming, I think there's going to be some people who may take advantage of that.
Yeah. I mean, are you one of these people who think that once the election is over and Biden is in lame duck mode, that he might start asserting himself in Israel, for example, in Ukraine? I mean, will we see any dramatic shifts because he has nothing to lose at that point? Or do you feel like the foreign policy we see right now is the foreign policy we're going to get until somebody takes over?
I think we're lucky if what we continue to do post-election mirrors what we're doing right now. Joe Biden is a very sick man. He's a very old man. I'm caring for aging parents right now, and one of them has dementia. And I know I can hear my mother's voice in Joe's voice and vice versa, the way they talk, the way they bring things up, the anger that they harbor. There was a Seinfeld episode where one of the characters was getting older. He says, as you get older, the only thing you remember are the grudges. And I think there's an element of that in Joe Biden that was present when he was powerful, when everyone still listened to him. Now the fact that he's so far beyond the pale that no one even pays any attention to what he's saying, I don't think gives him the ability to do anything. regarding Ukraine or regarding Israel. He can give it a try, but I doubt anybody's paying any attention to him, particularly if Trump wins the election and everybody knows the snowball just got pushed off the top of the hill and is starting to roll downward. I don't think anybody's going to pay any attention to Joe Biden. Not that he would come up with much of anything. And Kamala, the same thing. She doesn't have much to say.
Well, let me ask you, if she wins,
yeah,
what do you think the prospects are for foreign policy?
Well, I think you can turn around and look behind you for the last 4 years and get a pretty good glimpse of that, minus her inability to deal with Congress, with the mechanism of government. Biden, when he was still a full man, did have the ability to deal with the mechanisms of government. He didn't do it necessarily in the way that many of us would have liked to see, but he understood how government worked. And Kamala is going to walk in there basically a brand newcomer. She's going to remind me of Trump's beginning of his first term, when he was just trying to get a handle on how this massive government engine works. Tens of thousands of people moving in all different directions, and your job is to herd the cats in a particular direction. And I think Kamala is going to have a very hard time to do that. The fact that she is so empty-headed on so many issues means there's going to be lots of people standing around waiting to fill her head up with ideas. Right. The so-called deep state will be there to assist her, and I don't think that will be a very, very good thing. I worry about escalations.
Have a deep bench. Yeah. I am reminded of the new incoming Obama administration in 2009, where he was forced to put a lot of Clinton retreads into places, including Hillary Clinton herself as Secretary of State.
Oh, yes, I remember.
Yeah, and it disappointed a lot of people because they thought, okay, here's a guy who campaigned on ending the war, and now he's putting a lot of these Clinton types who are, full-throated humanitarian interventionists in place. And a lot of it was because I'm sure campaign promises along the way, but also you don't have a deep bench. He hadn't been in the Senate for long. Kamala hadn't been in the Senate for long herself. She's been campaigning a lot, whether on this campaign or in 2020, and she's vice president. But how much experience do you get? You get plenty of experience and lots of contacts while you're in office, but my impression is a lot of it's stovepiped. So she has her little staff, and the Biden team has their staff, and she didn't do a lot of foreign policy.
No.
They bragged that she had been out there and visiting and meeting with world leaders and leading a coalition in Ukraine against Russia. A lot of that was ceremonial. She was standing in the place for Biden, but I just don't know how she has managed to seed a coterie of experienced foreign policy people around her who would represent anything different than what we're seeing right now.
No, and she doesn't talk about foreign policy, and she doesn't seem to have anyone in her visible circle that is a foreign policy person. Trump's got Tom Cotton lined up on deck, probably going to be Secretary of Defense.
Oh boy. Say it isn't so, Peter.
Say it isn't so, but I hear we're very narrowly talking about experience and ability to move the levers of government. But he's got that. He's got some people on the foreign policy side that are going to be coming in who know how to make these things work. We've heard even Mike Pompeo's name kicked around again.
But those are old retreads. Those are old retreads. Those are the people who are going to keep us at war.
I agree with you. I agree.
Don't have that inclination.
We're talking narrowly about people who have experience. I'm not saying it's necessarily good experience, but it's experience.
Yeah.
The only advantage Kamala has, and it's kind of pathetic, is that the rank and file are probably not going to be lining up against her the way they lined up against Trump. Trump is going to be walking into office with this plan for Schedule F. And I'm sure your listeners are familiar with Schedule F, particularly the listeners inside the Beltway. Outside the Beltway, it's still kind of a mystery what it's all about. But essentially, it's going to take a number of civil servants, upwards of 1 million, who are currently basically assigned to their jobs for life. And it's going to make them into political appointees who serve at the pleasure of the president. Now, that doesn't mean Trump is going to fire 1 million people, one day. It means that all of their jobs are going to be dependent on Trump, and they're going to have to toe the line on his
Right.
policies and procedures, or they're going to find themselves pushed out of their jobs and replaced by somebody who will. And that's a very significant thing. It would be a very dramatic and significant change, really the most significant change to the way the bureaucracy of America works in almost 100 years since the Civil Service Act was put into place, 200 years since the Civil Service Act was put into place. The bottom line is you're going to see a lot of resistance in the rank and file with Trump. And so he's going to have to tackle that problem the same way he kind of failed to tackle it the first time through, and just everything just kind of went in different directions. So Kamala will have a little bit of an advantage, but I wouldn't go to the bank on just that.
Well, listen, we're out of time, but I really enjoyed talking with you as always. And I hope that you come back on the show, because I love your wisdom and your insight, and I always have. And again, I'm going to be putting all of your books in the show notes and your articles, and you're writing pretty frequently for the American Conservative, right?
Once a week. Typically, I published on Mondays. If people would like to drop by the American Conservative and see what is on my mind on any given day, please do. The books are all available on Amazon, and I would love to come back on your show anytime.
You will. Okay, well, and we'll have plenty to talk about after Tuesday.
I hope so. Take care.
You too. Thanks, Peter.